All right. What do you think, Yaz? Should we get going?
Let's do it.
All right. Welcome, everybody. On behalf of my colleague, Yaz, and I thank you so much for being here on this beautiful Friday afternoon, last day of NTC. Pleasure to be with you here today. You know, it was about a year ago this time, I was working on a project for a nonprofit up in Seattle, Washington to revitalize and relaunch their online user portal. And after that project went live, and Yas has since then taken over to manage their continuous improvement. And by all accounts, the project and their impact on their operation had been a huge success. And so, as Yas and I were reflecting back on what made that project and their go live so successful and had such a huge positive impact on their operations, the thing that we kept coming back to was at every step along the way, they kept their community front and center and they were focused on user adoption. And so that's what we want to talk about with you today is how can you use an online portal focused on user adoption to enhance your NGO operations and further your impact. So what we're going to talk about is first and foremost, what is an online user portal and how is this different from your website? And then we're going to talk about if you're thinking about going down this journey, what does that look like? At a high level, from start to finish, what should you be planning for as you approach an online user portal project? And at each stage along the way, what kind of questions can you be asking to keep your focus on your community and increase your chance of success with user adoption? After go live, Yaz is going to talk about how do you define and track adoption and then continue to invest in feedback and improvements in your portal. And throughout this, we're going to look at some screenshots and examples from that nonprofit in Seattle, Washington, which is the Recovery Cafe Network. Hey, everybody. My name is Saul Belisle. I am a project manager at Idealist Consulting. I've been a PM for about 6 years, and I'm coming to you today from Boise, Idaho. And it is my pleasure to be with you today talking about something that I am passionate about, which is bringing people together into vibrant, healthy communities. With me today is my colleague, Najeebi. Yaz is a multi-certified Salesforce admin and consultant who has been doing the work in the nonprofit, racial, gender, and climate justice world since 2015. And Yaz is joining us today from Denver, Colorado. All right, so let's start from the beginning and just really briefly touch on how is the portal different from your website? Because this is a question that I get fairly often. And when I hear it, 4 things typically come to my mind. The first thing is personalization. User portals typically offer a personalized experience and the ability to display content and resources based on a user's preferences, their roles, or their intended behaviors. So you can use a portal to create custom content or actions for different user groups, such as applicants, volunteers, grantees, or your internal staff. Along with that, portals often also offer the ability for authentication. So the ability for a user to log in with their username and password, which helps provide a secure role-based kind of limitation or access to specific information and functionalities. But also want to point out, that's not always the case. Many portals operate just fine without authentication, but it is a common feature that sets portals apart from many websites. The other thing that portals do really well is integration. User portals can integrate with your various internal and external applications, your databases, and your services to pull together information in a unified interface. So you can combine all of your systems and your outside tools, such as form tools, document generation, Salesforce data, into a single seamless experience that can become a centralized hub for your community to keep coming back to time and time again. And when you put those 3 things together, the 4th component of portals that set them apart is interactivity. Portals provide many interactive features such as forums, chats, personalized dashboards, and the ability to perform transactions or submit forms. So portals are meant to be actionable. So you can use a portal as a vital starting point, a middle point, or the end of your daily org processes. So personalization, authentication, integration, interactivity. These are what set apart a portal from a website. But when might be the right time to think about going down this journey? When should you consider if a online user portal is right for your organization? Let's go back to that last point for a second. Portals are interactive. They exist to drive structured engagement with your users. So you can use a portal to lead constituents through a guided process. You can use it to provide around-the-clock access, to connect constituents to each other from around the world, or to replace many disconnected separate systems into one centralized system. But beyond interactivity, portals are efficiently interactive. What they do really well is take interactions to scale. So you can, with a few clicks, quickly disseminate key information and materials to wide user groups and to specifically targeted user groups. If you operate through forms or transactions, you can improve data validity and use different sharing criteria to really increase your data quality and the data you have coming in. So in every way, portals really scale well, and they allow for efficient interactions with your online community. And what that does is it brings value for you internally because you can free up your internal staff for other high value work and continue to scale your care larger and larger. So what I would say is anytime your organization has grown to the point of either through volume or complexity, that traditional one-on-one communication methods such as phone or email no longer feel like they're keeping up, then you might want to consider like if a portal is the right next step for you and see how it might impact your operations because it really does help scale to the next level very efficiently. So if you're interested in going down this journey, or maybe you've already decided to, what I want to talk about briefly is what does this look like from start to finish as a project? And along the way, let's get back to adoption. What kind of questions can you ask so that when you go live, you have the highest chance of success that your users are going to be excited to come back and use your portal again and again? So for the next couple slides, I'm going to walk through this using a framework that we use at Idealist. I set this up to say that this is how I'm going to walk through this today, but everything you hear today is completely transferable to any other project management methodology or philosophy that you might use. So it's not like it's constrained to the Idealist way, but these are the project stages that I'm going to walk through, and you might just have to transfer this into your own in-house terminology or structure. Additionally, I'm going to be throwing out some key questions, and we're going to talk about the Recovery Cafe Network. We have some downloadable checklists and case studies in the session notes document if you want to take these away for further discussion later. So don't think you have to write all of these down in the moment if you're a note taker. All right, let's dive into it. We're going to talk through a quick project plan. Every project starts in the planning stage. Sometimes I call this pre-project. This is the stage that's all about internal alignment on your high-level goals. This is a stage that you might do completely internally or independently. If you're going to work with a partner agency, you could also do this stage with a client success manager or like a sales AE to help you find those goals. But this is all about internal alignment around goals such as what is your budget? What's your timeline? What is the scope of the project, as well as who on your internal staff can serve as project team members, either as testers or as subject matter experts. Who can you dedicate to the project for the entire timeline? This is a very early stage of the project, but even at this time, there's two questions that you can already be asking to focus on adoption. The first question is, what problems are you trying to solve for your end users? And it's very common to think about the problems we want to solve for ourselves. We want better data quality, or we want to have a more efficient process, right? And those are valid and noble problems to solve, but don't forget at this time to also think about what pain points is my community experiencing and how could this help them? Because when you go live, those are the benefits that you can highlight to get people excited about it and find that buy-in of what's in it for them. The other question to ask here, as you're thinking about the project timeline, is are you including time in your project plan for post-go live adoption and support? Too many times I see project plans that end the day the project goes live, and you need to plan internally to have staff dedicated for post-go live support, onboarding, and feedback. That specific timeline will look different for everybody, but you're going to get questions around after the go live. And so you need to be prepared to have resources dedicated to support that through the go live period. So that's what I would mention for the planning stage. 2 quick ways to focus on adoption during planning. So after planning, we move into discovery stage. If you're working with a partner agency, this is often the first time that you're meeting with your assigned project team. And this stage is all about taking those high-level goals and breaking them down to detailed requirements. So it's all about asking questions about who are your stakeholders, what are their pain points and their gain opportunities, what are their possible user journeys or the processes you want them to follow. And ultimately, what you're going to do, the output of this stage is a detailed list of requirements, sometimes called user stories. And you can track these in a spreadsheet, in a tool like Jira or Trello. We would use a tool called Story Navigator that lives in Salesforce. It really doesn't matter, but that is the output of this stage, is you've cleanly identified a list of requirements to be built, and that identify what's going to be built and how it's going to solve the problems you identified in planning. So while you're in this stage, 2 additional questions you can ask to get down to that requirement level. Number 1 is not only who's going to use the portal, but who's going to be impacted by the portal. Very often we think about the portal as for who it's meant to directly interact with. Maybe it's a grantee portal, but the further that you can zoom out your perspective and include departments or people upstream or downstream of that interaction, for example, program managers, finance users, your IT staff, the further you can zoom out, the greater your chance of success, because you're less likely to forget requirements or create conflicting requirements. So don't forget to move past not only who's going to use the portal, but also think about who's going to be impacted by the portal once it goes live. The second question that's a great opportunity during discovery to really dig in is, are you replacing an existing process or tool with this portal? And the trick here is you almost always are. Whether it's you're moving away from high email volume, where you're trying to get rid of phone calls, or maybe it's a separate system, multiple different systems, you almost always have some level of a process or a tool that you're moving your community away from. So you can use that as a jumping off point for what's working well in that current process, what's not working well in that process. Is the new online user portal going to be very similar or very different? Because that will impact your level of communication and helping your users through the change curve. So it's just another angle to think through discovery and try and get to that list of detailed requirements, is thinking through what does the current process or tool look like and how is it going to be adapted to the future process. So after discovery, like I said, at the output, you have a list of detailed requirements to be built. And that leads us into the build stage, where you guessed it, you build those requirements. This is often one of the most exciting stages, because you finally get to see some progress come to life in front of you on the screen. But it's also one of the most effort intensive stages, because you'll be asked a lot of questions and you'll be tasked with doing a lot of testing and providing feedback. So at Idealist, we would do this stage using an agile methodology, which would be breaking up all of the requirements into sprints and following a cycle of build, test, refine, build, test, refine, until all of the requirements have been built. So the key engagement during this time is being available to answer questions about the design, the key features, the interface, as well as testing, being able to test and give feedback to what is being built so it gets closer and closer to your end vision. Because this stage is so effort intensive, there's 2 questions that I find commonly get put on the back burner. Um, the first one is, are you testing as specific personas? And what I mean by that is during discovery, hopefully you identified not only the direct end users, but also auxiliary upstream or downstream users. And when it's so busy, it's easy for me to log in as myself, as Saul, the project manager, and test from my perspective. But you have to log in and go through the user journey from each different persona to really get a holistic sense of feedback and testing quality. So don't forget to set aside time and effort to log in and test as individual personas from their different perspectives. The other thing that's often missed at this time, because it's so busy, the go live date starts to sneak up on us. And we often get to the end of the build stage and realize like, oh shoot, we need to go live in a couple of weeks and we haven't told anybody. So now is the time to start communicating that change to your community. And this doesn't have to be anything super complex. You don't need a whole marketing campaign, but any way that you're able to start to communicate this coming change to your end users will pay dividends to the way that they receive it and interact with the change once you go live. So if you primarily use email, you could add this to your signature. Hey, new portal coming fall 24. If you have a website, maybe you could add a banner. Ask me about the new portal coming August 24. Anything at all that lets people know a change is coming and they should be excited about it will go a long way when it's time for them to actually be excited about it. So don't forget to test from different perspectives, and don't forget to communicate to your community that a change is coming. After the build stage, it's really a downhill sprint to the go live. There's a couple last stages that you have to get through. This is where you have your last rounds of feedback and quality assurance, your last rounds of integrating feedback. If you have any data migration in scope, this is when you would finish that data mapping, transformation, and migrate that data to the new system. And then it's all about training, communication, and going live. So this is definitely the most exciting stage of the project because you finally get to share with your user base all of the work you spent the last several weeks or months crafting. And I think because it's so exciting, because there's so many little small things to get done in this stage, there are two things that I find often get forgotten in kind of the hustle and bustle of the go live. The first thing is, how are you prepared to train your external users? And what I mean by that is we often think about, we have to train our staff. We think about how do we train them for getting the right permissions, the access, how do they use the system? But we have to remember that when we go live, for most of your online community, this will be the first time they ever see or interact with this portal. And so that can come with a wide range of emotions. Some people will be excited, some people will be confused, some people may be frustrated, but a certain segment of your community is going to come to you with questions. They're going to come to you with frustrations. The level to which you're able to anticipate some of those questions and be prepared for it will go a long way to help your user community just feel supported, feel like this change was intentionally made, and they will feel engaged to keep coming back and keep trying again. So this could look different again for every organization. It could look like having some documentation ready, some FAQ sheets. It could look like having some talk tracks ready for your internal staff to highlight the benefits or to walk people through the processes. You could set up some office hours for some guided training, whatever it may be, but try and set some intention to providing support and training for your external users, and it will pay dividends as people come back because they know they can come back to you with questions or frustrations and feel supported and heard. The last thing I want to mention at this stage is after you go live, what is your plan for collecting feedback? Too often I work with clients that, for whatever reason, feel as if feedback will just kind of come pouring in. Maybe it's because they have a really tight-knit community, maybe they have really great relationships, but they seem to think that after they launch a portal, people will just take time out of their day to give unprompted feedback. And I mean, to be honest, I've never seen that happen. If you want feedback and if you want quality feedback, you have to ask for it. And again, this will look different for everybody. Maybe you set up some surveys at 10 days, 30 days, 90 days. Maybe you do some focus groups with your super users. If you have great relationships with people, maybe give them a call and ask for direct feedback on a specific feature or process that they're using. Whatever it is, whatever it might look like, have a plan for it and set some intention around asking for feedback so that you can then respond to it and after go live, invest in continuous improvement. So that was a speed run of what a project plan looks like, but essentially you set your high level goals, you break it down to detailed requirements, you build, test, and then at the end, you put it all together, you communicate and you train and you go live. So I'm gonna pass it off to Yas now, who's gonna talk about after go live, how do you monitor and track adoption and how do you invest in continuous improvement?
Thank you so much, Saul. That was so informative and helpful. So as Saul mentioned earlier, my name is Yaz. I also work with Idealist Consulting, and I still work with Recovery Cafe Network in a managed services capacity. So this is the client that Saul was talking about. That sort of inspired him to want to do this presentation. So I've had the pleasure of seeing the cascading positive effects of a thoughtfully planned and launched portal as I've been working with Recovery Cafe Network. And what I do with them primarily is support them in bringing secondary functionality into their portal. So as I spend the rest of the presentation discussing strategies to drive adoption for a new self-service portal, I'll also be giving examples from our Recovery Cafe Network case study, just to add a little color. And so for context too, for everyone who doesn't know who Recovery Cafe Network is, they essentially nurture self-starting groups across America that seek to start recovery communities based on Recovery Cafe Network's model, which is something called the Recovery Cafe. So because of the inherent scalability of their model, they're like a franchise, like they're very tech heavy. It's part of why a portal is like such a useful tool for them. But also because of the nature of their work, there are plenty of low tech folks that are interacting with Recovery Cafe Network on a daily basis. So that's really influenced the design of the portal in a way that I think is interesting for a case study. Could you click to the next slide, Saul? Thank you. So to drive user adoption for your new portal, it's important to create materials that are going to help communicate the change, like Saul was talking about. And it's important to make the adoption process as easy as possible. That seems obvious, but some keys to success in the process are that your communication is transparent. So it's like clear what is going on. It's also a really good idea to highlight the benefits to users in the email that you send out, for example, to launch your portal or build anticipation for it. Actually telling people why it's a good idea or the problem it's going to solve for them is really going to help drive adoption. And if you spend a lot of time and energy in your discovery process, you're going to have like a lot of really clear language about the problems that the portal is solving to be able to recycle into those like more marketing style communications. And of course, you just like want the onboarding process to be as simple as possible. If you can put as much of the setup into the portal in a guided way as possible, I strongly suggest that. It's way better than getting a series of like 6 emails. However, if that's what you have to do, then like just make sure they're really clear. Something that you may want to consider is using a small group of users and doing a test run where you onboard them and then incorporate their feedback into your onboarding process. So just sort of doing a demo. Doing this with a small group of users, maybe it's a set of constituents that you have a really close relationship with, it can generate positive feedback that you can then incorporate into your launch communications. So like, in other words, like it's a good way to get testimonials. And also their input may influence other changes that you make to your launch communications or to your onboarding process. So like you may think that your like 20-step email instructions are very easy to follow and everyone inside your organization agrees. And then you do a test run and you find out that like that is actually not the case to the average bear. And then that influences, the changes that you make to the communications before you send them out live. It's also an opportunity to just identify issues that you may have overlooked. Like if you and all of your colleagues are all logging in from the same IP address, you may find that like a user that logs in from, Texas, like they have a problem that you didn't foresee, or if they use Safari as their browser, like there's a problem you didn't foresee. So it's always a really good idea to just test as much as possible before you launch it out to everyone, and working with a small group of users is a really good way to do that. Next slide, please, Saul. So lastly, on this point, you can even straw poll users about design choices that you were unsure about. That's like a really good use of time if you're doing a test launch. So this is an example from Recovery Cafe Network's launch. This is their knowledge library, so it has all their support articles in it. And they weren't really sure which design direction to go to or to go with, and with their main navigation. And they got conflicting feedback from their users. And so they ended up actually doing this balanced highly visual navigation at the top for low tech folks that had tiles that were easy to click and use for like hot topics, or the most introductory level documentation. And then on the bottom, they have this like highly textual kind of index style navigation for the people who are like, I know exactly what I'm looking for. Like, I just got to go in and get it. I don't need any frills. And, because they test ran with users, they were able to identify ahead of time that having a balanced navigation was just going to make everything easier for everyone. Next slide, please. So adoption, of course, has a clear definition. It's the process by which people or organizations accept and use technologies. But it's a good idea to internally identify what adoption means for you all in a qualitative way. Like Saul mentioned, are you trying to like divert users from a different technology? Or are you trying to get them to do actions in the portal that they were doing elsewhere? Is it necessary for your users to use the portal? Like, what does it actually mean for you all to have people adopt it? And then it's also a good idea to think about in a quantitative way. How do you know that adoption is happening? Like, is there a certain number of or percent of users that you want to be set up in the portal? If you're trying to sundown another platform, like, can you actually do that? Like, when will you know that you can actually do that on a quantitative level? These are all good things to think about ahead of time so that you can sort of set goals and just go in intentionally into the adoption period. And the last thing to think about, or another thing to think about in terms of, what adoption means to you all, is to think about like how long is your adoption period. So that period after go live, when you're actively intentionally working on driving adoption before you enter, your new status quo or your sort of like stage of continuous improvement. If you could click the next slide, Saul. Another really good thing to think about with adoption is identifying and monitoring metrics. So, in terms of like, what does adoption mean for you all? Are there actual reportable metrics that you can get from your portal? So this is an example of out of the box reporting or monitoring tool from Salesforce Experience Cloud that Recovery Cafe Network used for monitoring adoption. It shows the number of new users and some other statistics. So if you have something like that, it's cool to take a look ahead of time. Plenty of different CRMs have stuff like that. But if not, you can try to see what else you can report on or what other data you can gather so that you all can have metrics that you monitor throughout the adoption period. You may want to look at like the number of users that are logged in versus signed up, or like the number of potential users versus actual users. You all get to decide what is important to you all, but knowing that you can monitor that stuff and monitoring that stuff and setting goals and expectations is just going to make your adoption more effective. Next slide, please. And then, of course, like we can't stress this enough, feedback is essential to adoption. So a couple key things are just making sure that people can actually give you feedback. So if you have like a contact form on your webpage, or if you actually ask people like Saul was talking about, or if you have like a sort of a comment box, little like pop up on your website, it's also a good idea to record it in a way that's reportable. So if you use an object that already exists in your database for feedback, that's a really good idea. You could have different custom fields that you use to assign the priority of the feedback internally, or distinguish between like what kind of feedback it is. Is this praise? Is it a bug? Is it an enhancement request? Those things are all important. And then during the adoption period, of course, you're not going to be able to respond to all of the feedback, and responding is not always going to be clear cut, but you want to make sure that you know what you actually will respond to during the adoption period. So that may be issues, bugs, like critical fixes, accessibility issues. And you may want to like set criteria. Like if 10 people say that like they don't like the fact that this page is green and it hurts their eyes, then like we'll change the color. You may have like a very opinionated and vocal user base. Not everybody does. And then, of course, you want to follow up with people who are not adopting. That's a great use case for a drip email campaign. And you can, of course, incorporate, again, those like positive pieces of feedback that you get as testimonials to encourage non-adopters to adopt by showing what your actual adopters are saying about the portal and how it's useful for them. Next slide, please. I'm gonna kind of speed through this because we're a little short on time, but investing in continuous improvement is very important for the longevity of your portal. So you may not be engaging with feedback as intensely and intentionally as you are during your adoption period, but setting a monthly review cadence is a good idea, or bi-monthly or something like that. Having sort of like a small caucus where you're able to identify trends and consider bigger lift enhancements, or also look at different metrics to understand if adoption is happening on a larger scale is also just a good idea. It's also a nice opportunity to be able to work with partners and potentially tie in other more complex actions into your portal. And that's exactly what I do with Recovery Cafe Network. We bring in like additional functionality into their portal. So if you could click the next slide, Saul. This is a really good example of that. On the left-hand side, you'll see what they launched with. This is the sort of like out of the box grant tool that they had with their portal so that their users could actually see their own grant applications and edit them. It just wasn't super intuitive, but it was good enough at the time. And on the right-hand side, you'll see that there's this more guided setup wizard with all this validation and supporting help text that I was able to set up with them in a managed services capacity. It wasn't something that was essential for Go Live, but they got enough feedback about it that they realized it was important. And when they were able to set aside the time and resources to be able to work on it, they did. And they only knew that because they were being intentional about monitoring their feedback. So that's sort of my last note on adoption. If you could click the next slide, Saul. We have, of course, given you all a lot of information, but as Saul mentioned, in our collaborative notes document, we've got the link to this presentation. Of course, y'all will get the link to this recording. Thea, our fabulous content marketing manager, has included a link to the case study that we did with Recovery Cafe Network, if you're curious about that, as well as our downloadable project checklist that'll have like the basic core questions for all of the stages that we've talked through. And we've just got some other posts from the Idealist Consulting blog on portals that can be helpful there. So yeah, we've really enjoyed putting all of this together, and we hope you guys are able to make good use of this info. And thanks so much. Good luck with your portals.
Well, thank you to our presenters, and thank you all for attending today. I hope you have a great rest of your conference, which I think is probably just one more session. Take care, y'all.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, guys.
Have a good Friday.